In today's episode, we will discuss situational judgment tests and why it matters whether they have an open response format or a closed response format, especially when they're used in higher education admissions. Let's talk about holistic success. Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Dore, co-founder and VP of Science and Innovation at Acuity Insights. Welcome to this episode of the Holistic Success Show. Here with me today is Dr. Mohammed Zafar Iqbal. Dr. Iqbal is a research scientist at Acuity Insights where he contributes to the development of the test content and has improved practices and procedures for our Casper Situational Judgment Test. He has over 10 years of academic experience, primarily focused on the continuous improvement of assessment practices. His areas of research interest include assessment practices, competency-based education, faculty development, and co-creation. Welcome, Zafar.
Well, hello. Hello to you, Kelly, and our listeners. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about situational judgment tests, or as we know them as SJTs today, which is a very vital tool in professional program admissions these days. As someone deeply involved in designing open response SJTs, I would really like to shed some light on what are their key benefits and challenges and how they compare to the other available options.
Zafar, I have to tell you, I am so excited to have this conversation with you too. As the co-creator of a situational judgment test, we made an intentional choice to do an open-ended format, and it's different sometimes than what exists out there. So I'm thrilled and excited that you're going to be walking us through the pros and cons of different response formats and really talking to us too about what are situational judgment tests and how they can help programs. So maybe let's just start there. Zafar, you have spent so much time in the area of assessments. And for people who aren't as familiar with them, can you please go into what a situational judgment test, or SJT, is?
Just explaining in a relatively easier term, a situational judgment test, or as we know them as SJTs, these tests are designed to evaluate how individuals would respond to realistic scenarios or dilemmas that a professionals would likely encounter in their daily lives. The primary objective of these tests is to go beyond knowledge or academic ability and assess their non technical competencies. For example, communication, empathy, professionalism, teamwork, or problem solving, etc. etc. Think of SGTs as a bridge between theory and practice. Unlike a knowledge test that focuses primarily on facts, SGTs provide nuanced insights into behaviors and social judgments.
I think that was a beautiful explanation. And it's really a different type of assessment that a lot of people might be familiar with who maybe have been interviewed for a job or do the interviewing for their program or maybe for their department or division, where they ask maybe more questions, tell me about a time you've managed multiple priorities. It's a very different type of feeling and type of way to get this information. And so tell us a little bit more about why higher education programs are moving towards situational judgment tests, or SJTs.
Such a wonderful question. And we will dive deeper into the alternative options in a bit. But here I would like to focus more on why higher education programs use SJTs in the first place, or why do they need it? So basically, higher education programs, particularly in the field of healthcare, medical education, law, engineering, and business, they aim to admit candidates who are not only academically smart, but they can also demonstrate key interpersonal and professional competencies. It is very, very important here to highlight that why we really need to evaluate these professional competencies. It is because we are continuously observing a paradigm shift in higher education in almost all professions and almost all geographies. But what that shift is towards producing competent professionals instead of knowledgeable professionals. As an evidence, I would like to highlight some of the key competency frameworks that have been designed and implemented widely in the last 2 decades. For example, let's start with medical education. As we know, there are some very famous frameworks, for example, CanMEDS, ACGME competencies framework, Tomorrow's Doctor. There are some regional frameworks, for example, Saudi Meds framework, AAMC pre-med competencies. Similarly, there are other frameworks in business education, engineering, law, and other professions in parallel. While closely looking at these frameworks, our listeners might realize that the majority of the competencies highlighted within these frameworks are basically non-technical or soft skills or competencies. Good news is that SJTs are uniquely positioned to assess these non-technical attributes in a structured and standardized way. Now, there is a good amount of literature available that shows that SJTs can successfully and reliably predict applicants' level of competence, which makes this tool an ideal supplement to grades, GPAs, or other standardized scores that are usually used in program admissions.
That was nicely explained, Zephyr, because I think one of the things, and I mean this just complements it so much, is we hear about AI and what that means to higher education and jobs and everything that's coming. And one of the most sort of poignant quotes that I heard from Deloitte actually was that AI isn't going to take away jobs per se, but it will fundamentally change the nature of all jobs that we do. And when Deloitte talks about it, they speak to the fact that there should be more emphasis on what they describe as these humanistic skills. Sometimes we refer to them as durable skills, which are these, sort of non-technical, non-knowledge based competencies that you say, as you say, exist in all of these frameworks already. We just really have struggled with how to measure them in a defensible way. So maybe let's go back to say, okay, so if a program is considering an SJT, how does an SJT compare to other admissions tools it might already be using?
When we talk about the traditional assessment tools, for example, GPA or cognitive tests, they are the strong predictors of academic success. There is absolutely no doubt about it. But these tools often fall short in assessing interpersonal and professional competencies, which are absolutely essential in today's time and age, as we just discussed in the previous question. SJTs fill this gap very beautifully by providing a behavioral lens. This is something very important to consider. There are definitely some other options available which can be used to assess non technical competencies. For example, reference letter, personal statements, interviews, and multiple mini interviews, also known as MMIs. But there are some limitations that are severely impacting their quality and utility. Unfortunately, for example, reference letters and personal statements have poor reliability and predictive validity. They can also be gamed by using LLMs such as ChatGPT or taking support from other people's, for example, peers, seniors, etc. As far as the interviews and MMIs are concerned, the biggest challenge for these interviews and MMIs is the examiner bias. Also, these tools are known to have resource intensive for the programs. These are not easy to conduct. You need a huge human force to conduct them. And obviously, time and resources are to be the biggest barriers when it comes to MMIs and interviews. Now, keeping in mind the limitations of these traditional measures, SJTs have emerged to be a cost effective and psychometrically sound method for assessing applicants' professional competencies earlier in the admission process. For example, there are multiple studies that now show that SJTs are more consistent and less prone to bias as compared to their alternative counterparts. Also, incorporating SJTs into the admissions process has shown to improve the holistic evaluation of the candidates and making sure that the programs get diverse applicants for their programs.
I love that you've sort of brought in this holistic lens too, because what always reminds me is that while SJTs add, I love the analogy of adding more pixels to the picture to get a holistic image of who these applicants are. Measuring these competencies, whether we call them non-academic or personal, professional, or durable skills, what's important is that these are all metrics of holistic success in the professional as well, whether we're talking about in business or in medicine or nursing, or as a physician assistant. All of these have, as you've defined, these competencies, which include these attributes, and needing to measure them in a defensible way. SJTs, though, as you and I both know, are not all the same. We use the term SJT to broadly describe these types of assessments, but they don't all look the same, they don't all behave the same, and they don't all measure the same things. So, can you walk us through some of the common test formats?
SJTs have typically been used to assess non-technical skills. I beg the pardon of our listeners, because there are multiple terms that have been used in the literature and over the course of time. For example, non-technical skills, competencies, social skills, soft skills, and etc. etc. Not to deviate from our main conversation, but I once conducted a poll on Twitter that what would you call these competencies? And trust me, I received so many mixed responses that there was no clear-cut winner. So,
We can have
circling
a whole holistic success show on that, Zephyr. I feel like you and I could go on for a while about that.
absolutely. So now circling back to the main question, let's call them non-technical skills for now, and please bear with me with that. So basically, programs have used SJTs for to assess non-technical skills or competencies, and there are different formats to do that. For example, if you look into the medical education literature or health professions education literature, you will find SJTs that are mostly clinically oriented, and where people have used clinical vignettes in the form of text or in the form of videos. There are some cases where they have used videos as well, or pictorial representation of a scenario. Although in those cases it's very difficult to differentiate between OSCE and SJT, but still, just quoting what I've seen in the literature. If we move away from clinical context in general, SJTs can be divided into mainly two kind of formats. For example, one format where we use textual representation of a scenario or a vignette or a dilemma or a situation, and the second one is a video or pictorial presentation of the same problem. So basically, two different fonts, two different formats, I beg your pardon. One where there's a textual scenario and another one where it's a video scenario. So basically, that's pretty much it.
Okay. And so, in that particular situation, an applicant or a student would see either a little video vignette, a short video vignette, or they would see a short text based of the same vignette. You could imagine. We'll have another episode of the pros and cons of those, Zephyr, because I know there's more to it though. Because once they've seen that scenario, it's about how you're getting the information out to evaluate them on these non technical skills. And again, response formats are not always the same. How we expect students or applicants to respond don't remain the same. And so maybe you could walk us through the most common response formats.
So basically, there are two predominant formats for SJTs. One is open response, and second one is closed response format SJTs. In closed response SJTs, applicants choose from predefined options where they either rank the options, they either pick the one best possible answer, or they sequence the responses based upon this is the best option, this is the second best, this is the third best option. And based upon their selection, test takers can use different kind of rubrics to assign different kind of grades to them. When it comes to the open response SJTs, as the name is make it pretty obvious, applicants generate their own responses explaining how they would handle a situation that is presented to them either in the form of a textual scenario or a video based scenario.
Okay, there's a lot more here, I know. So let's maybe start and go back to closed responses. And can you walk us through the pros and cons of that response format? Because again, it's different than the open response format. Walk us through the pros and cons of closed first, and then we'll come back to open.
As you said, there's a lot to unpack. So, response formats, whether multiple choice, ranking, or free text, basically both of them affect the depth and type of the data that we gather from these responses. So, please allow me to focus more on the closed responses first. So, basically, when we talk about the closed response SJTs, they are easier to score and scale, relatively easy to construct as well. But there are some serious limitations and that compromise the quality of these tests. Let me explain those issues one by one, which have been advocated a lot in the literature. First biggest concern is that there is a limited depth of insights into applicants' thinking. This is problematic because they can choose answers for only given options and they don't get the opportunity to explain their rationale for their choices. Now, basically, when they are forced to pick a choice and we don't know the reason behind it, this means that we are inherently limiting ourselves from looking into the personality or the behaviors that they would have presented otherwise. My second issue is that these tests can easily become a guessing game because applicants can randomly select the answers based on their intuitions, or there's a factor of cheating as well. My final and the biggest concern of all, probably the mother of all concerns, is that closed response SJTs are easily gameable, especially with the introduction of the LLM tools such as ChatGPT. There are multiple reports that hint towards it. For example, one study done on closed response SJTs in UK found out that the 76% of the applicants were able to game SJTs using ChatGPT. And this is a very concerning number for me. Similar findings have been found in other studies as well. So basically, these issues collectively put a big question mark on the validity and the reliability of closed response SJTs.
Okay, and we'll link those articles in our show notes as well for everybody. I have to say, Zephyr, you might have noticed me smiling during some of your responses. I have to tell you, I've told this story to many people, that I was the person when I had multiple choice tests or closed format tests. I wrote my reasoning in the margins. Not not because I thought anybody was looking at it. Sometimes these were, I will date myself, in the bubble fill out sheets, but it was something I would always do because I wanted people to understand the why behind my responses. And I think you're right in terms of the gameability. I have been a advisor for people trying to create SJTs, and I've gone in and looked at some of the ones that they've created. And it actually, you can cover up the question and actually identify what is the most appropriate response based on just looking at the response options, because it's hard to create alternatives that are right but not quite right in terms of that, at least in my experience thus far. So let's contrast that maybe with open response, because I think this format, despite the fact that you and I know it well, is actually less familiar to folks who might know situational judgment tests or just even the assessments literature. This type of response format's a little bit less familiar. So jump into the pros and cons for open response format.
I do understand the appeal of closed response SJTs, especially because you don't need too many resources for that. However, considering the limitations in mind, I would like to expand on open response SJTs. Before I begin this, I would like to highlight here that the essential purpose of SJTs is to look into the human perspective of an applicant. And we can only do that when we know more details, because personality is not a dichotomous scale. We cannot simply say black and white about a person. There are lots of shades of gray here. So, how do we do that? So, open response format basically provides an opportunity to look at those shades of gray within the responses. In other words, when we come back to the open response SJTs, these tests have the ability to capture richer, more authentic responses, shedding light onto one person's reasoning, behaviors, and values, which is actually the center of SJTs. Open response SJTs use behavioral tendency questions to ask the applicants what they would do in a given situation. So basically, open response SJTs try to learn more about hows and whys rather than whats. Now, this is a very clear distinction between open response and closed response SJTs. The use of the behavioral tendency questions are important for two distinct reasons. First, behavioral tendency questions correlate more with the assessments of personality rather than measures of technical knowledge abilities. Second, behavioral tendency questions have shown to produce lower demographic group differences relative to the knowledge type questions. However, like any assessment, it has some limitations too. For example, open response SJTs are resource intensive, as we need expert test developers to design the unique test content. Second issue is the examiner's or rater's bias. I take pride in saying that our open response SJT, which is known as Casper, this is free from these two problems. And I would like to explain very briefly here, and please ignore my personal bias. First of all, we have an extensive team of content experts, and our content goes through multiple iterations, which ensures that our test measures exactly what it's supposed to measure. This is a very important thing to highlight here. We have a lot of experts within house and also external subject matter experts from whom we seek support from time to time and consult them to make sure that our content is streamlined and free of any kind of errors. Secondly, the responses of each applicants are rated by multiple raters, which helps us significantly reduce rater bias. Our consistently high test psychometric properties and high inter-rater reliability provides us with the necessary evidence to feel confident that Casper is a sound tool to measure social intelligence and professionalism. So basically, if you want me to summarize it all, closed response formats are efficient and reduce rater bias, but may oversimplify complex scenarios and are severely prone to gaming. Whereas open response formats encourage creativity and critical thinking, providing richer data on how candidates would approach in real world challenges.
I love that explanation, Zephyr. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think, it is again, and you spoke to this, but I want to reinforce it's up to those who are constructing and creating the test to make sure that they're monitoring the data, because it does depend on the process you use to create content, the way you've trained your raters, and the way you look at quality assurance around your rater process. So it's important that everybody engages in that, and such an important part of going beyond the test format to sort of say, how do you make sure that you're maintaining the quality in your assessment? I feel like you and I could talk about this for a few hours, but in the interest of our listener, is there's one thing, one take-home message that you'd love to leave people with?
If there's one thing I hope you take away, it's this. So the choice of SJT format should align with your institutional goals. Please make sure that you do what you can possibly do. While closed response SJTs are efficient, open response SJTs often are unparalleled in providing depth and understanding to applicants' judgment and behaviors while they're making their responses to the complex problems that are presented in front of them. And that is where the nuance and authenticity matters the most. Indeed, open response SJTs offer a superior choice when it comes to a holistic assessment of the applicant's social intelligence and professionalism. And of course, we are here to help you should you wish to go with open response SJTs such as Casper. Thank you.
Zephyr, thank you so much for sharing your insights and really just a great conversation today. I have a feeling we may be seeing you in the future. We can do another one on the content format of SJTs to unpack the why behind the choices in that. To all of you, thank you so much for watching and listening. If you have not yet subscribed to our show, please do so and share this episode with any colleague or anyone who you think might find it useful. And with that, we'll catch you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Holistic Success Show, please be sure to check out our other episodes. We have episodes coming out regularly all the time, so please be sure to subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all things related to student and program success in higher education.